much. And I'd like to welcome Susan Golombok. I just quickly say why Susan at this stage. One is she has recently brought out her book in paperback, which I've given you a flyer for. I bought the hardback 2 years ago in your family, but and even inadvertently I left the price on it. And why I think for Treoir, as we've seen, we've discussed a lot about families this morning and different kinds of families, and particularly focusing on non-marital families. Now, Professor Susan Golombok is the expert on families. She is an acclaimed international really author, and she's a psychologist, and she began first of all in the UK. She's always been in the UK, but in different parts of it. She began first researching really lesbian families. The focus has always been on children, development of children within families, because and her book is delightful. Absolutely, I would recommend it. It's a great read, but the press, as you know, often give families a bad time and say particularly it's bad for their children. So lesbian families, gay families, all the rest. So she has taken a very evidence-based approach all over her long distinguished career on researching families and the development of children in different family types. And the number of family types that she's covered in her book, it's like the development of debates on families in England. And we're doing the same. In fact, I think we're making more progress, I think, than some of our families, as witnessed by our new constitutional referendum and amendment. But she has done lesbians, donor conceptions, sperm egg embryos, surrogates, wonderful stuff, and the subtypes of the name. I won't spoil her presentation for you. And she ends up, the last one, which I was reading on the train, Future Families Pioneers. And it's a very good read. What I love about it is she blends the social change. She uses media to situate all of these different families over time, but then she uses very evidence-based research on the children, speaking to the people, and raises, in the end, a lot of the voice of children, how they feel about being the families in these the children not unusual families. So it gives me great pleasure, and I'm really pleased that she's agreed to speak to us today by Zoom. And as I said, I hope you find it very interesting, but I know I sound like the late, but it is a very, very good read. It's very sensitive, very informative, and it's beautifully written. So, and it's very appropriate for Treoir, because I must think, as we've discovered this morning, Treoir is a trendsetter, in terms of actually embracing new family types. We've done stuff in thirds, what I mean? We're an inclusive organization, and I think it's appropriate and good to have her present to us. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me first of all?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Evelyn, for that really kind introduction and the very nice things that you said about my book. And also thank you for inviting me to speak to you today, which is a great pleasure. I'm really sorry I couldn't come in person because that's always so much nicer, but it was the only way that on this particular date was possible. So thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to do is give a bit of an overview of my research on different kinds of new family forms, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So I'll start at the beginning in terms of how I got involved in this field of research. It was rather a long time ago. It was 1976. And I happened to pick up a copy of the feminist magazine Spare Rib, which had this picture on the cover, which was about the fact that lesbian women had begun to fight for custody of their children at the time they and their ex-husbands divorced. And at that time, without exception, they lost. So in these days, custody was always awarded to the father, not the mother, which was unusual because in the 1970s, really custody always went to the mother and not the father. So the article inside talked about these cases and the fact that they were battled out in court with experts on behalf of the mothers and experts on behalf of the fathers. But everything was based on the best interests of the child, but there was absolutely no research on what actually happened to children growing up in lesbian mother families. And the article called for a volunteer to carry out an independent study of these children. And at the time, I was studying for a master's degree in child development. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting issue, and one that I felt, I would like to study for my master's project. So I volunteered, I plucked up courage and contacted the person in the article who had asked for someone to come and do some research. And after meeting them, they decided that, they would support the work, help put me in touch with families. And what started off as a really small master's project, actually then, because of changes that happened in society, ended up being a topic that is still being, and I'm still involved in to this day, so more than 40 years later, which wasn't quite what I'd expected at the time. So anyway, that's where the research of my own research and that of my team on modern families all started. So in the custody cases in these days, there were really three main arguments against lesbian women being allowed to have custody of their children. Firstly, it was argued that lesbian mothers were less nurturing than heterosexual mothers. Secondly, that the children would experience psychological problems. And thirdly, that growing up in a lesbian mother family would have an impact on children's gender identity and gender role behavior, so that boys would be less masculine and girls less feminine than boys and girls growing up in heterosexual families. And in these days, of course, that was seen as being a major problem. So we began the study, and actually at the same time, two other very similar studies were conducted in the United States, and all three came to the same conclusions. Firstly, that lesbian mothers were just as involved and nurturing and committed to their children as the heterosexual mothers in our comparison groups. The children were no more likely to experience emotional or behavioral problems, and there was no impact of growing up with a lesbian mother in terms of children's gender identity and gender role behavior. Now, all of this, in terms of the custody cases, was going on underneath the radar, certainly in the UK. And that all changed a couple of years later in 1978, when a London evening newspaper, the Evening News, exposed a private doctor in Harley Street in London, who was offering donor insemination to lesbian couples to enable them to have children. And when this hit the headlines, there was a huge amount of outrage. It was the first time that the general public had been, even thought about the idea of lesbian women having children. It was just something that wasn't kind of in the public domain. And questions were asked in the Houses of Parliament and the House of Lords, and there were calls to ban these babies. In fact, both in the UK and in the US, clinics at that time were beginning to open that were offering donor insemination to lesbian mothers. And a number of studies of the children and of the families were carried out in the coming years, both in the US, the UK, and other parts of Europe. And the findings were, in fact, the same as the earlier studies. So what was different here is that these children were growing up in a lesbian mother family right from birth. So to the extent that fathers make a difference to children's psychological adjustment and gender role behavior, it was thought that perhaps, these early years were very important. So we couldn't generalize from the first studies to children born through donor conception. But in fact, various studies were carried out and are still being carried out, and the findings were exactly the same. Now, 1978 was a big year for new family forms because it was also the year the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, so the first baby to be conceived outside of the human body, was born in 1978. And again, that was something that caused quite a furore in the press. There were concerns that somehow these children would be different. Sometimes they were being described as Frankenstein children. So they were kind of quite wild statements being made about them, but also there were sort of some genuine concerns that these children, because the parents had gone through years of infertility and fertility treatment, their parenting would be different. They might, for example, be very overprotective of their children. But from a psychological point of view, there were really, the concerns were more to do with not so much IVF when the mother's egg and father's sperm were used, but more when donor conception was used to conceive a child. So although sperm donation had been happening for quite some time before IVF came along, it became much more widely used at that time because there was a growth in fertility clinics and interest in treating couples' infertility. So in terms of donor conception, in the early days, this was just sperm donation. And there were concerns really from two points of view. Firstly, that if a child lacked a genetic relationship with the father, as was the case if they were conceived using sperm donation, then the non-genetic parent may not fully accept a donor-conceived child. And secondly, there has been, and still ongoing, a debate about secrecy. The idea is that if parents are not open with the children about their donor conception, about their origins, that this may have an impact on children's psychological well-being and on the relationship between particularly the non-genetic parent and the child. So we began in the early 1990s a European study of assisted reproduction families. And this was the first study to look at children born through in vitro fertilization, where they were genetically related to both parents, and also children born through donor insemination, where they lacked a genetic link with the father. So this study was a collaboration between the UK, the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. And we recruited to the study more than 100 IVF families, more than 100 donor insemination families, and two comparison groups, a comparison group of adoptive families where the child had been adopted early in infancy, and also a group of natural conception families. And we followed up the children. Well, we started the study when the children were age 6, and we followed them up again just as they were entering adolescence around age 12, and again as they were approaching adulthood at age 18. And in spite of the concerns about these children, in fact, we found that where there were differences, the assisted reproduction parents showed more positive relationship with their children than the natural conception parents. So in terms of measures of warmth towards the child, emotional involvement with the child, how much they interacted with the child, and a range of other variables, the assisted reproduction parents had higher scores than the natural conception parents. We found that the donor insemination and IVF families were very similar, so no differences between them, and the adoptive families fell between the assisted reproduction and the natural conception parents. In terms of the children, they were all doing well. They showed high levels of psychological well-being, but those in assisted reproduction families with the more involved parents weren't doing any better than the children in the other family types. But there was one very striking finding, that of the 111 families where the child had been born through donor conception and lacked a genetic link with the father, less than 10% of parents had told the children about their conception by age 12. So these children were growing up thinking that their father was their biological father. And we interviewed parents about why they hadn't been open with their children. And the main response was that they feared that telling the children would have a negative effect on the positive relationship that existed between the child and their non-genetic father. And many felt that by age 6, they left it too late to tell. They were worried about the impact of telling, but also they felt they didn't really know when to tell, how to tell. Whereas, for adoption, there are lots of storybooks and resources. In these days, that wasn't true for children born through sperm donation. So we were very interested in the impact of openness with children about their donor conception versus secrecy, which we couldn't look at in the first study because so few had been told. So we began a new study 15 years later. So it was actually at the millennium in the year 2000. And here we just focused on families with children where third-party conception was involved. So we compared 50 families with a child born through sperm donation with 51 families with a child born through egg donation, because that had become possible by that time. So these were children who lacked a genetic link with their mother. And again, we recruited a comparison group of natural conception families where the children were genetically related to both their mum and their dad. This has been a longitudinal study. It's only just recently ended. We have seen the families 7 times. So first when the children were 1, then we went back to the family homes to reassess them at ages 2, 3, 7, 10, 14, and finally at age 20, as when the children were young adults. So what did we find? In the preschool years, the age 1, 2, and 3 assessments, we found the same as we had in our earlier European study. So where there were differences, they reflected positive parent-child relationships in the assisted reproduction families. And even that was true with a non-genetic parent. And we also found the children to show high levels of adjustment. We were interested in whether they were planning to tell the children about their conception. When the children were 1, we found that 56% of the egg donation parents and 46% of the sperm donation parents planned to tell the children about their genetic origins. But in reality, fewer did so. So when we went back at age 7, we found that only 39% of the egg donation parents and only 29% of the sperm donation parents had told their children about their conception. And that's actually a bit of an overestimate for the egg donation parents, because although some of them had talked about IVF, they didn't tell the children that a donor egg was involved. Now, age 7 is an interesting age, because by then children will have made the transition to school, but they also will have developed a more sophisticated understanding of the notion of biological inheritance, what that means. And it's also by that time adopted children have a better understanding of the meaning of the absence of a biological connection to their parents. So it's not just that they've gained a family through adoption, but they have lost their birth family as well. So at age 7, when we went back, we were interested in the impact of telling or not on family relationships. Firstly, those parents who had been open with their children had done so by the time the children were 4. And even though this was a difficult thing for parents to do, it made them very anxious. They found that actually when they did talk to their children about the conception, their fears were unfounded. So the children either weren't at all interested or they were curious, but not one reacted negatively or were distressed. We did find some differences between the disclosing and non-disclosing families. So we found that there were higher levels of emotional well-being among mothers in families where they had disclosed to the child that they were donor conceived. And also that we found that the relationships between mothers and their children were more positive in the disclosing than the non-disclosing families. But although these mother-child relationships were most positive, the children themselves weren't any different, although they generally continued to show high levels of adjustment. We next went back as the children were entering adolescence or just in early adolescence at age 14. And again, we found an association between talking to the children when they were young, and that is in the preschool years, about their conception, and more positive mother-child relationships at age 14. What was interesting about this finding is that it came out separately with our independent ratings with the mothers and with the adolescents themselves. So the fact that the results were the same for these two different respondents in the family gave more weight to the findings. We also interviewed the children directly about how they felt about their conception, those who were aware, and generally they were just not concerned about it. So to give an example, a sort of fairly typical example, this child said, "I don't think it really affects anything. My dad is still my dad." Many of them were interested in finding out who the donor was, and some wanted to meet their donor, but that wasn't true of everybody, so there was variation in that. So the last time we saw them was when they were 20. And again, we found associations between finding out about the conception when they were young and more positive relationships with their mothers. We also, again, found that mothers showed lower levels of anxiety and depression when they had been open with their children. So just again, to give a sample quote from one of the young adults who was donor conceived, he said, "I think it's pretty interesting. It's quite unique. So in that sense, it's pretty cool. I like the fact I'm a bit different, even though it's weird because I don't look like my mum, but I don't see that as an issue as she's my mum." So in the UK, in 2005, the law changed to allow donor conceived people the right to find out the identity of their donor when they reached age 18. And in fact, so these were children conceived from 2005 onwards. So in fact, this is the year that the first young people will be legally entitled to go to the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority and ask for the identity of their donor. It looking as if the first young people are likely to come forward later in the year, so maybe October and November. At the moment, we have no idea how many will, or even how many will be able to find the donor, because for some, all that's available is an address 18 years ago. But certainly we're waiting with kind of great interest to see how this all pans out towards the end of this year. In thinking about this issue and what might happen, we several years ago carried out a study with the Donor Sibling Registry in the United States, which is a website that enables donor-conceived children and their parents to link up with other families conceived through the same donor and for them to meet their half siblings. So children born using the same donor but growing up in different families. And we asked the young people what it was they would like to know if they could ask their donor. And the main things they wanted to know were, Do I look like him? Is my personality like his? And they also wanted to know about the donor's family background. So, about the donor's family history and who else were in their family and so on. Interestingly, we found that although they wanted often to meet their donor, sometimes just information from the donor, they were much more interested in forming relationships with their donor siblings than with the donors. Which in some ways perhaps wasn't surprising because they were often only children. And then they were finding that they were finding these half siblings and other families who were often very much the same age as themselves. And often they were forming close relationships and ongoing relationships with them. We asked them about their feelings about discovering they were donor conceived. And again, we found that the age at which they were told they were donor conceived made a difference. So just to give you some examples, Anna, who was 13, found out at age 4. She said, "I've always been accepting of it because I never knew any different." And her response was pretty typical of young people who found out very early in childhood, whereas those who found out later were more likely to be upset. So Mandy, who was 19 and found out at age 12, said, "It was one of the most shocking and upsetting experiences of my life. I felt alone." Now, we've just begun, but several years ago, we began a study of families with identifiable egg donors, because although egg donation came later than sperm donation, when these children become adults, they will also be able to find out the donor, in this case, their egg donor. And we were interested in whether it might perhaps be more problematic to be born through an egg donor than a sperm donor, maybe for the child's mother. And we just had questions about this and no answers. So we began this study a few years ago now. The children are, we last saw them when they were 5, but we began the study when they were 1. And we recruited 85 egg donation families and a comparison group of 85 IVF families where the mother's egg was used in their conception. During pregnancy, we found that many of the mothers were concerned about the non-biological relationship of the child that they would give birth to. They were worried that they might not bond properly with the child. So the first mother said, just to give you a few examples, and I'm afraid I can't read all of my quotes here, I'm sorry, but hopefully you can see them on the screen because there are pictures in front. But the first one said, "My only concerns were, how was I going to feel about him when he arrived? Whether I would feel that he was mine." Another mother said, "That's all I thought about before he arrived. I was just like, oh, what if we don't bond?" And another said, "That was my whole preoccupation. Would I bond with this baby? Would this baby bond with me? My biggest fear was that this baby would think, who the hell are you?" So this was quite a concern during pregnancy. But after the baby was born, for the large majority of mothers, the concerns disappeared and they felt very much the baby was their own. So this mother said, "I don't think I could love him more if he was completely my genetic material." But there was still a small number who 1 year after the birth did struggle with the idea that the child was not genetically related to them. So one mother said, "Biologically, they're not my children, even though I was pregnant with them and I gave birth to them. And that's still quite a hard thing for me to square in my own mind." At age 5, we went back to see them again, and about half of them were worried to some extent about the prospect of their child making contact with the egg donor when they reached age 18. So one mother said, I'd be worried that they suddenly have this unbelievable connection that's perhaps true of a biological mother. And perhaps what we've got isn't a true mother-son relationship. I don't know. It worries me. Another mother said, a fear of mine is that he might really like her and her family, and in future Christmases decide to spend time with her rather than us. And another mother said, that's probably why I nurture and care for her so much more, because I want her to know that I absolutely adore the ground she walks on. I don't want her then to say, well, you were rubbish. I'm going to go and find who's biologically mine. I want to overcompensate, I suppose, because I don't want her to go and find the donor. But the other half of mothers were actually who positively embraced the idea of finding out the donor's identity. So one mother said, although they'll have me as their mum, genetically, there'll always be, things, questions they might ask or just information they want about themselves. And I think it's important that, they have access to that information. And another said, I'd be disappointed if my child doesn't contact the donor because I can't make that decision, but I would like to meet the person. So moving on now to surrogacy. So perhaps the most controversial kind of assisted reproduction. This is Kim Cotton, who was Britain's first surrogate mother in 1985. Who again caused a great deal of outrage when she gave birth to baby Cotton for another couple and was paid to do so. So the government quickly brought in the Surrogacy Arrangements Act that same year, which banned commercial surrogacy, and then revisited some of that act in 1998. In the Brazier Report, which was a 3-person government committee that I was part of. And in being involved in that committee, it showed me that there were lots of unanswered questions about surrogacy, particularly in terms of its impact on families and on children. So there were lots of questions such as, are children psychologically harmed, but they had been, that they'd been created specifically to be given away to other parents? And what would happen if they knew that large sums of money had changed hands? Also, who do the children see as their real mother? Is it the surrogate who gave birth to them or the mother who brought them up? And what happens if the surrogate is their genetic mother, as sometimes happens when the surrogate's egg is used? And thirdly, if the surrogate remains in contact with the family, does it undermine the relationship between the intended mother who's raising the child and the child? So alongside the study that I've just spoken about that we began at the millennium, following children up from infancy up to age 20, we also recruited a representative sample of surrogacy families through the Office of National Statistics, using the same measures. And we found that parents and children had very sensitive, involved, warm relationships all through the study. The children showed high levels of psychological well-being, but we did find at age 7 raised levels of adjustment difficulties in the surrogacy children compared to the other family types in the study. Now, this had disappeared by age 10. And by age 14, they were doing extremely well in terms of self-esteem, mental health, and so on, and also right up to age 20. Now, it's possible that it was just some kind of blip that caused a problem at age 7. But in fact, I think that's probably not the case, because the same finding has been shown by researchers who studied internationally adopted children, finding an increase in problems at age 7 that disappear by the time they approach and enter adolescence. And adoption researchers put that down to the children having to deal with issues of identity at an earlier age than other children, and especially in internationally adopted children, families with these children, because they look different from their parents and everybody else knows they're adopted. And I think it's very likely there's similar processes going on in surrogacy families, because it's hard to hide surrogacy. People know how these children were born. And it's also the age at which children understand more about what surrogacy means. So I think this is probably a real finding. But in fact, this is the only study in the world to have followed up children born through surrogacy. So it really needs replication by other research groups to be absolutely sure. But generally, beyond age 7, these children were doing extremely well. Another concern about surrogacy is that the intended parents would treat the surrogate badly, and once they had their baby, would reject her. But we found in our families, who were all went through surrogacy and lived in the UK, that in fact, that wasn't the case. Many formed very close relationships. And 10 years on, 60% of the families were still in touch with the surrogate. Again, we spoke to the children themselves, because it was thought that these children would be very upset when they discovered they were born through surrogacy. And we found again that wasn't the case. So Simon, age 14, said, "I was talking to someone at school and they said they were an accident. I know I was really wanted and it makes me feel special." Chris, also age 14, said, "I think it's cool. I quite like talking about it because it's an interesting fact about me." And Luke, at age 20, said, "It's not a big deal to me. It seems clear they wanted me as a child, as opposed to it being accidental. I'm happy about it. I've always been happy about it." So I'm going to leave surrogacy. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour around different modern family forms. So I apologize for rushing from one to the other, but I just would like to mention a few other family types. And one is single mothers by choice, which again was problematic and attracted a lot of press coverage when it became known that single women were having children. Single women without partners were having children through donor conception. Sorry, I've just received a text. I'm worried that it's from Sinead, from you, so I'm just going to open it in case there's a problem.
It's not you? All right.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't think it is from you. I think it was from someone. Please excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, I just worried that maybe you couldn't hear me or I was going on for too long or something like that. Okay, single mothers by choice. So the main concerns about single mothers by choice really stem from earlier research on divorced single mothers and unmarried single mothers, where their children on average did tend to show higher rates of problems, but it wasn't so much to do with them being single parent families. It was more to do with the drop in income that families experienced after divorce, the higher rates of depression in mothers following divorce, and also the fact that children had sometimes or often actually following divorce had experienced conflict in their families before the parents divorced. But single mothers by choice are of course different because they're not subject to these risk factors. But they're different and potentially have risk factors in other ways, in that they don't know the identity of their biological father. So we carried out a study of single mothers by choice and found we first saw them when they were around between about ages 4 to 6. Just as with the other families, positive parent-child relationships. And we compared them to donor-conceived children in two-parent families with a mum and a dad. But at age 4 to 6, they were really too young to fully understand what it meant not to have a father. So we followed them up 4 years later, by which time they did understand the significance of that. But again, we found positive relationships with their mothers and high levels of psychological adjustment. The one issue that the mothers did talk to us about was that the children actually became aware and began to ask about not having a father much earlier than they'd expected, some from as early as age 2.5 and 3. So the mothers were having to deal with this issue sort of earlier than they had expected to. I'll now say just a little bit about gay father families. So in the UK, new legislation came into force in 2005 that allowed same-sex couples to adopt children jointly. Now, before that, lesbian mothers or lesbian women were adopting children, but they couldn't do so as couples. They could from 2005, but the other change was that after this time, gay father or gay male couples began to apply as prospective adoptive parents. And there was some concern about this by local authorities and adoption agencies, because there was this idea that men are less suited to parenting than women, and also that gay father families would experience greater stigmatization than lesbian mother families. And it was argued that because we're talking here about very vulnerable children who were all, adopted from care, being in care of the state, then this could be difficult, or at least there were concerns about not knowing anything about what happened to children in these families. So we then began a study of adoptive gay father families, and we recruited a group of 41 adoptive gay father families and compared them with 40 adoptive lesbian mother families and 49 adoptive heterosexual parent families. They were all two-parent families, and we studied them first when the children were on average age 6. We actually found more positive outcomes in terms of the gay father families, which was it wasn't what we'd expected, and certainly what some of the people who were concerned about it would have predicted. We think this is probably for several reasons. Firstly, all of the heterosexual adoptive families and half of the lesbian mother families had been through unsuccessful fertility treatment before turning to adoption. So adoption was really a kind of second option for them. Whereas the gay father families were fathers who'd always wanted to have children, but didn't think they would ever be able to do so. So for many of them, it felt kind of like a dream come true. And so when they were, when they went through the whole screening process and were able to adopt children, they became very involved and committed parents. The children showed fewer emotional and behavioral problems as well, which could have been because of their very involved gay fathers. There might also have been an element of because there were concerns about placing vulnerable children with gay fathers, perhaps the most challenging children weren't placed with them. So we're not quite sure why that was. We then went back at age 12. There were no differences between family types and the quality of parenting between parents and children in the 3 family types. However, the rates of psychological problems had doubled. No difference between family type, but across all 3 families, the rates were very high. So 50% had either a learning difficulty, a psychological disorder, or often both. And this isn't surprising because these were all children who were adopted from care, who'd experienced very traumatic early years, sometimes for 3 or 4 years, before they were placed with their adoptive family. So many had experienced emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect. Many of the parents had abused drugs and alcohol. Many of the fathers had been in prison. some for sexual offences. And so these children had experienced very difficult early years, which is really not surprising that so many of them had difficulties by the time they were aged 12. So in fact, rather than these fathers perhaps parenting in a less positive way than the other family types, with mothers, we actually found that the adoptive gay fathers were coping very well with extremely challenging children. And I'd just like to tell you about one family to give you a flavour. So this is Diego and Melvin, who had 3 adopted children, all from different parents. The oldest, Carrie, was 15. Carrie's birth mother was 13 and in foster care when Carrie was born. The next one down, Robert, at age 11, he was the youngest of his birth mother's 14 children. His birth father had committed serious crimes and was a risk to children. Robert was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. At school, he was performing at the level of a 7-year-old. And the littlest one, Jamie, age 4, his birth mother grew up in the care system and became pregnant at age 18 with her 14-year-old boyfriend. Jamie was born with cerebral palsy and has impaired speech, mobility problems, and behavioural difficulties. So these were really challenging children. This was Diego, one of the dads. He said, talking about being an adoptive parent, "It has enriched our lives. We've done amazing things. We've been on wonderful holidays. And even the little one who has cerebral palsy loves football. And he's in a special football team for children with cerebral palsy. The paces are small and tiny, but I think they're more special because they're huge steps to these kids. I'm delighted," and he then goes on to say, "I'm delighted when they come in. They'll say, 'Hi,' they give you a kiss and 'What's for dinner?' You polish their shoes and they'll sort out their homework and you help them where you can. And you thank your lucky stars every morning that you've got these kids. And then you think, imagine if they were still in care." And the challenges these parents face were really, we saw this across the board for all 3 family types. The last, I'm just going to very briefly mention gay fathers through surrogacy. Some of the concerns about these families were the same because the children had 2 fathers. They also had 2 mothers, in a sense, the surrogate and a separate egg donor, but no mother in the family home. This was a study we carried out in the United States because at that point there were more families, gay father families through surrogacy in the US than there were in the UK. This was a study of 40 gay father families and 55 lesbian mother families, again, all 2-parent families. And here we found very positive outcomes in both kinds of family. And we found even lower levels of emotional problems for the children of gay fathers. Again, this could have been because they were really, really committed and wanting to be parents. Another suggestion that's been put forward is that perhaps men are less sensitive to emotional problems, but whatever the reason, these children were doing extremely well. So it suggests that any difficulties in the adoptive families had nothing to do with the fact they were being raised by fathers. Okay, so where are we today? So from 1976, we're now at May 2023. We have same-sex marriage in around 30 countries and more than 8 million IVF babies have been born worldwide. But that's not entirely the end of the story. So there's still a lot of prejudice against particularly LGBT families. Here, an article in The Guardian showing demonstrations on the streets of Paris in 2019 against a change in the law to allow single and lesbian women to have children through donor insemination. And also in 2019, demonstrations outside a primary school in Birmingham where the curriculum involved talking to children about different kinds of families, including families with same-sex parents. So it's still the case, not as badly as before, but children in lesbian gay families are still sometimes exposed to prejudice and discrimination. Less likely to be outright bullying these days, but more low level, like the use of the word gay as a pejorative term, which can be upsetting for children in same-sex parent families. So we did a study with Stonewall a few years ago about children's experiences at school, children with same-sex parents. And the children said that their families weren't really represented. They said, like one child said, the videos they used to show you in school, all about life and everything, it would be the conventional family with a mum, dad, kids, and a dog. It wasn't two mums and two dads. It was always a mum and a dad. Another child said, talking about teachers not being very sensitive to their family, I can still remember when I was younger, we had to draw a medal that said number one dad. I said I didn't want to do it. This was a child with lesbian mothers. My teacher said, just do one, don't moan. And I found that really hard. Another child said, I wish I could talk openly about it to people. I'm too scared of what would happen, of what they would say. What about if they told someone? Although it might not seem a big thing to anybody else, it does to me. The nice thing about this study, we spoke to over 80 children, and the children themselves put together a set of 10 recommendations for schools about how they could do better for children with same-sex parents. And just to give you a flavour, here are 4 of the recommendations. Don't assume everyone has a mum and a dad. Talk about LGBT families at school so the children don't always have to explain. Use teaching materials with different family types, and respond to homophobic bullying, which the children said didn't always happen. If you want to see all 10 of these, this is available on Stonewall website, and they also have produced resource packs for teachers. So I'm sorry, it's been a really quick sort of tour through different family forms, but I'd just like to kind of come to some conclusions now. And looking at all these different kinds of families and looking at the impact on parenting and on children has really led me to the conclusion that family structure, and by that I mean the number of parents, the gender, sexual orientation and genetic relatedness of parents, matters less for children than the quality of family relationships. But generally, we found that parents' openness with their children about their origins makes a difference, and also acceptance of their family in the wider social world. So put another way, just because people become parents in non-conventional ways does not make them less capable parents or love their children less. It seems the opposite is true. Where differences have been found between new family forms and traditional families, these differences suggest that those who've struggled against the odds to have children become particularly involved and committed parents. Or as Alice, age 7, summed it up, I've got 2 parents who love me. It doesn't matter if they're a boy or a girl. Thank you very much. So I will stop sharing now.
Thanks very much, Susan, for that tour de force. It was quite an encyclopedic and historical presentation, so thank you very much for it. We have some time, I think, for questions. I know people are rich. It's a lot to take in, but the book has a lot more, and I think it raises, she raised all this. We're approaching a lot of those issues. We're kind of slightly ahead of possibly something. But are there any questions or further elaborations for anybody? Sinead, can you manage the questions?
None online yet.
Yeah. Bernard?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I thought it was really fascinating, intriguing, and kind of enlightens, in terms of how, I suppose, changes evolve. And there's obviously, you can hear me, there's obviously seems to be a kind of a resistance by society to change. But I wanted to ask us around surrogate mothers, surrogate that there's a question in Ireland at the moment around just in terms of parental, say that in terms of rights, where people don't, particularly around surrogate parents, that you don't seem to have the same rights. So when you do go abroad, and then in terms of the birth cert. So I'm just wondering in the UK, because it seems to be that you've done incredible research, and I was really taken back by the level between somebody who's that 20 years research is obviously one of a kind. But could you kind of enlighten me on that, like in those kind of surrogacy parents?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that question. That's a study. So I think you're asking about what happens if couples go abroad for surrogacy and the implications of that for their relationships with their children. Is that right? Yes.
And legal rights. The legal rights.
The legal rights. Okay. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll answer the first one and I'll try and answer the second. I'm a bit out of my comfort zone when it gets to the law. But I mean, we haven't, all of the surrogacy families we studied, they did surrogacy in the UK. And clearly there are some very different issues if we just put the legal issues to the side for a moment, but just in terms of the children being able to find out about who the surrogate is. And, in some cases, this also might be their genetic mother and not just their gestational mother. And for children who do want to find out about that person, and we know it's not important to all children and young people, but there's certainly a sizable sum, who do want to find out more about a biological, somebody who was involved in helping them to be born. And that's very difficult often if children have been, the surrogate has been in another country. So I think my colleague Vasanthi Jadva is actually very interested in this issue and is planning to do some work on it. But, that's the particular challenge. From a legal point of view, in the UK, the Law Commission in England and also in the Scottish Law Commission have just put a paper to government suggesting that the law is changed in many ways. And I think one of the driving forces behind that is to make surrogacy easier in the UK, well regulated, but easier, so that couples are less likely to go abroad. Because as you are kind of alluding to, there can be lots of legal issues if children can sometimes be left in limbo because the laws in the country of the surrogate don't match with the laws in the UK, and they kind of get stuck, and the parents then can't become their legal parents without it can be very difficult depending on the country. So I think the view in the UK is trying to prevent or discourage, rather. I mean, I don't think it's going to be illegal for people to go abroad, but I think the idea is that it becomes much more straightforward to have a child through surrogacy in the UK, and it's also well regulated with lots of protections, so that the number of couples going abroad will be reduced.
Just have a leading question, and I'll come back. But just in terms of research, the ethnicity, because there's really intriguing, because so there's kind of broader questions, but I won't go into them. But just on the research around particular groups, because you just kind of did you've done that study over 20 years, but in that, in the UK, it's very cultural diverse, isn't it? It's very diverse culture. I would say.
Our samples aren't particular. I mean, we've always tried to get as representative samples as possible, but we find that the proportion of ethnic minority families, especially in the earlier studies, were pretty low. So too low to look at the specific issues and challenges faced by these families. Sorry. Yes, I think another question. Yes.
The question really is that, I'm assuming that's kind of pretty much a white, general kind of society rather than the diversification of society. The study.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Sorry.
So I'm just kind of highlighting this because the sample was taken 20 years ago, where maybe it wasn't, it was more of a challenge in terms of going down that path and making that decision. It probably didn't reflect the society now in terms of multicultural and how people would perceive that.
Would you think?
Yes.
I think, yeah, I think for some communities, they mightn't see that as an option, where now it probably is seen as more coming in towards, more mainstream. So it's really about also affordability and how that's been, that's been done. But obviously the state
I think another, sorry, I'm just going to say, an issue then is often for families to find donors from their same, ethnic group or religion or, whatever it is that's really important to them. And, often there are very few donors who will meet, the criteria in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So that's a challenge. But in terms of what you were saying earlier, I think we can learn a bit from adoption in terms of, families that adopt a child from a different ethnic background into their family and the challenges that poses. And you're right, as a lot of our studies were carried out quite a long time ago, and particularly, looking at large cities rather than perhaps maybe rural areas, that has certainly changed, and it does raise these kinds of issues. But our samples, just that was the way they turned out to be, because that's how they were. But I think, these will be questions for future researchers to look at.
Well, we have lots of questions.
Yeah, I just two quick questions. When people are, so when we have parents nowadays who are having children in terms of donor conception, okay, what's obviously said to them is that it's obviously much better to be telling the child younger, okay? So I work for an organization where we're doing work around supporting parents to start the conversation with their child. So it's a counsellor led and it's a research piece with it. Is there something similar in the UK, or is there research around what supports parents need to make them more comfortable with the conversation around telling their child, or what are the barriers to it? Because there are barriers, if you don't start, then it's easier to continue on not having the conversation, then leave it till later.
I'm afraid I didn't hear some of that, because I think when the camera was turning around, it was creaky and it went over your voice. I'm sorry, but I think you're asking about, I think what you were asking is about parents telling their children and ways of facilitating that. Is that right?
That's right. Best
Yeah, thank you.
practice.
So in the UK, there's a very good organisation called Donor Conception Network. It's available, just look it up online. And they have produced a lot of resources to help parents begin to talk to their children about their conception. So they've got books, they've got videos, they've got young donor conceived people talking, a whole range of things. They also run support groups, and it's really their mission in life the mission of that organization is to support parents in being open with their children about their conception. So, and there are now books, and also in the US, of course, it's similar. So I hope that answers your question, but I would really recommend the Donor Conception Network.
Okay.
And they also, they run support groups for parents to help them with that issue, with how to begin to talk to their children.
Thanks. Damien, you were next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Susan. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, but if you could speak up, my hearing isn't great. Sorry.
Get closer to you.
Loud and slow.
Just thank you so much. What really struck me is that when you showed the news articles from the 70s, the fear that was generated, genuine concerns maybe, but just fear of change that people have, and your research so pioneering and been able to show the evidence that really what mattered was that people were loved and cherished and minded, and that most problems then can be met head on in that regard. But two parts of the question really is, one is about the new family types and probably having to go through the same thing all the time. You know, by new, I'm thinking of transgender families where parents are transgender and new issues that might emerge that we haven't even begun to think about as science keeps advancing all the time. And poly, I don't even know if the term is right, polyamorous, but families where there's multiple parenting involved, and how that brings fears. And we've already heard some of those thoughts that might be there. And the other question, the second part of that was around what in the UK is the birth certificate like? Because like in adoption, whereby the parents choose not to tell, the child may not find out for life unless it's something in their birth cert will highlight the fact that they were either adopted. And is there changes to the birth cert system in the UK? And is that something that we could look at without maybe it being a form of stigmatization for others either? But that is the birth cert and the birth registration a way that you might be able to find out your parents chose not to tell you something?
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. So in terms of your first one, we actually have done a study of 35 children with transgender parents. So children who've experienced their parents' transition. I nearly put it into my talk, but I thought I'd probably put too much in already and you'd all be falling asleep. So I didn't. But I mean, if anyone's interested, I can send the papers, but just very, very quickly that I mean, the findings are really pretty similar to the children, for example, with same-sex parents, that a lot of the problems they have are not within their family. They're more from the way their family is treated outside the family. So that's what upsets them the most. But for some, I mean, these were all children who'd experienced a parent's gender transition. And for some children, this can be a very difficult thing. Again, we found the age of the child when this happened seemed to make a difference. It happened when the children were very young. It was easier for them in a way. But also, again, it's really similar patterns. Communication was really important. So the children said, you know, those who knew that their parents were talking to them all the time about what to expect, what was happening, and so on, found it much easier than those who, you know, where the parents weren't really explaining things to them and they found it, you know, that made them anxious. They didn't know what was happening. It made them upset. So really, again, communication is key here. But also many of the children said to us, you know, at the time they found it all a bit distressing, but then they realized that the parent who transitioned was much happier and family life was much happier. So it was quite a kind of complex set of findings, but I can certainly send you these papers if they are of interest to anybody. I think actually there's a chapter on them in the book as well on children with transgender parents. The other question about birth certificates is, so in the UK at the moment, this I don't think it is on the birth certificate. Certainly it's not obviously on the birth certificate, because the idea is that it should be up to parents. So although the law has changed to allow donor conceived young adults to find out who the donor is, it is up. I mean, you may think this is a good thing or not a good thing, but it is up to the discretion of parents to whether or not to tell their children. And so I think many more parents are being open with their children these days, particularly as it's now so easy for children to discover their donor conceived on the website, you know, 23andMe, Ancestry.com. There's a lot of stories of children discovering their donor conceived by accident when they've been given a, you know, genetic testing kit for Christmas or something like that. But at the moment, the way things stand is that it is up to parents. So if parents don't tell their children, they won't necessarily know there's anything for them to find out. It's still a debate, but that's where things are at the moment.
So that's our Veronica.
Again, Susan, just thank you for the wonderful presentation. But what I was fascinated at was the finding with donor conceived children, that they were actually more interested in having maybe information and contact with possible siblings than with their actual donor parent. And interestingly, you know, the way you were talking about, we learned so much from adoption. And Darragh O'Brien, you know, the comedian, he has spoken publicly about being adopted and then meeting his birth parents, but he's also put great emphasis on then meeting all his fellow siblings, etc.
Yes.
So again, just thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, we were actually surprised by that finding. We hadn't expected it, but you know, just how many were really in close relationships and seeing their half siblings quite often, and all the families getting together.
Yes, you, sorry.
Me, yeah. Yeah, I'm just interested in this idea of it up to the parents of the recipients of the donor. Is there any part of the conversation where, you know, if there's a medical need for the child that is born of a donor, because obviously if their parents aren't genetically connected, there may be at some point in their life where that genetic connection is required for medical reasons, i.e. for kidney donation or, you know, some other.
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. I don't know whether in that case they would be legally entitled to find out who the donor is at that point. Sorry, I'm not so well up on all the legal ins and outs of it all, but yeah, I just don't know. But it's a very interesting question. I shall try and find out.
Are there any other questions? Susan, I'd just like to say that it's interesting, we're going through a lot of legislation at the moment on surrogacy legislation in Ireland and differences they have in, you know, bill to actually facilitate surrogacy within the country. They're calling it domestic surrogacy. That always passed it. But there is a lot to do the external foreign surrogacy because it's seen as commercial. You know, so we're having those debates at the moment. But it's very useful for us, I think, to hear what you have to say and also to see what's happening. We always keep an eye on Ireland, what's happening in the UK and Scotland and maybe in other countries. So I think the basic points too that you're making in terms of information and knowledge at an early date, it's interesting because we have just been recovering from the whole explosion of historic data and adoption and mother baby homes, all of that, which I'm sure you've heard lots of, but it's just the secrecy of that period. So I think there's a kind of a greater respectability for, you know, less secrecy and more information now. So I think the timing, in fact, of your work and making your work, you know, dissipating your work here in Ireland, it is important, and that not to fear that the child will be affected by kind of information and others. So I must admit that was one of the things I garnered very clearly from your report, and the, you know, the accuracy and the detailing of it. And the second major thing, which is again very good in the book, is the whole what you mentioned in the surroundings in terms of the stigma. And we all are very familiar with that. It comes up the whole time we've had cases here. That is how children are treated by the community and how their families and mothers and fathers treat like them. That's what makes life hard for them, really hard for them. So that's something we are increasingly aware of that in Ireland, but it is a huge issue. And again, you demonstrate that, I think, you know, very clearly in how you write about and locate the children and the families within the broader society in the UK. I think is a strength of the book. So this is new research too. So like a good author, she keeps the latest study for the next publication. But I really would like to thank you on behalf of all of us for a splendid and very clear, I think, presentation of your work to date. It's been very informative, very helpful, very supportive, and very thought-provoking, I think, for all of us. So I thank you very much for making the time.